The trauma bay was never quiet at 2 in the morning. There was always a sound underneath the sounds, the hiss of the ventilator in Bay 3, the slow percussion of monitors, the particular squeak of Wheel 4 on the gurney that no one had fixed in 6 months. I knew every layer of it. After 4 years on night shift at St. Michael's, the sounds of the ward had become a kind of language, and I had become fluent. So when the doors crashed open and 4 men carried in a 5th, I heard the silence first. Not literal silence. The monitors kept going. The ventilator kept hissing. But the men who carried him, large men, expensive coats, faces arranged into expressions I had never seen on civilians, moved without speaking. No one said careful or easy or watch his head. They moved with the precision of people who had done this before and expected to do it again. I moved toward them the way I always moved, without hesitation, clipboard already in my hand. "What happened?" I said. One of the men looked at me the way men like that look at nurses, like I was furniture that had spoken. "Knife wound," he said, "left side." "How long ago?" He did not answer. I was already beside the gurney. The man on it was, large was the wrong word, contained was the right one. Even bleeding, even with his dress shirt cut open and the dark stain spreading beneath his ribs, he lay with a stillness that was not unconsciousness. His eyes were open. They were very pale, the gray of old ice, the gray that comes after color has decided to leave. He looked at me, not the way the men around him looked at me. The way a person looks at a person. "Sir, can you tell me your name?" "Volkov." His voice was perfectly level, it should not have been. "Nikolai Volkov." A pause. "Yes. I'm going to cut away your shirt. There's going to be pressure on the wound while I know what happens next," he said. I stopped, just for a half second. The other men in the room had gone very still. I kept cutting. Around me, other nurses were backing slightly away, not fleeing, not obvious, but the subtle recalibration of bodies in a room when something has entered it that changes the temperature of the air. I had worked in this hospital for 4 years. I knew what fear looked like when it wore professional clothing. I kept working. "Depth is approximately 4 centimeters, I said to no one in particular because I was the only one close enough to see. "Clean entry, you're lucky." "Lucky," he repeated. "The blade didn't rotate." "Someone stabbed you in a hurry." The gray eyes moved to my face. "You can tell that. The wound pattern tells it. Rotated blade leaves a different tear." I pressed a gauze pad against the site and met his gaze because looking away would have been a choice, and I had not decided to make that choice. "Does it hurt?" "Yes. On a scale, 7. He said it the way someone reads a number off a page. It was a 9. "I've had worse." Something in the room shifted. One of the large men cleared his throat, and I understood that they had not expected him to answer that question honestly. Neither, entirely, had I. I began the suturing prep. That was when I heard it for the first time, very faint, barely present, more breath than sound. I was humming. I do it without knowing. A low, nameless melody, the kind that comes from somewhere below conscious thought. The kind that happens when my hands are working and my mind is a tool rather than a person. I stopped when I realized he was watching my hands. "Don't stop," he said. I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. And after a moment, without deciding to, I began again. He did not look away from my hands for the next 40 minutes. When I finished, I stripped my gloves. "You'll need to come back in 48 hours for a check." "Infection risk in." "Unlikely," said the large man by the door. "Knife wounds don't negotiate," I said. I looked at the man on the gurney. 48 hours. Nikolai Volkov looked at me for a long moment. "What's your name?" "Nurse Renard." "What is your name?" A pause that I did not entirely control. "Celeste." He said nothing else. But as the men began to move around him, as the machinery of his world closed back over him like water over a stone, I heard him say one word to the man nearest the door. Quietly. With no particular inflection. Voroby, Sparrow. I didn't know then that he was speaking of me. I learned the Russian later. My apartment was 17 minutes from the hospital on a good morning. 14 on nights like the one after Nikolai Volkov, when the adrenaline hadn't finished leaving yet, and I walked faster than I meant to through streets that smelled of the Neva and diesel, and the particular sweetness of the linden trees that bloomed. For exactly 3 weeks every year, as if to remind you that scent. Petersburg had once been a city that believed in beauty. I made tea I didn't drink. I sat on the edge of my bed and looked at my hands. They were steady. They were always steady. That was the thing about being a nurse. Your hands learned to behave better than your mind. Your hands went ahead without you, did the work, came back to report. The mind was the slow one. I was still thinking about the way he'd said don't stop, not as a command. That was the thing. Men like that and I had lived in St. Petersburg long enough to know what a man like that meant. Even if I could not have named his specific category, men like that gave commands the way other people gave directions. As information. As geography. The world went this way. You will go with it. He had not said it like that. He had said it the way someone says please without knowing they're using the word. I thought about that longer than was useful. I came back to the ward at 6 the next evening for my shift, and Timur was already there. He was Nikolai Volkov's driver, as it turned out. He'd been sent to check on things, which appeared to mean standing in the ward corridor, eating something that looked like compressed cardboard while engaging every passing nurse in conversation. This is raw cacao and almond butter on flaxseed crisp bread, he told me when I stopped to redirect him to the waiting area. He held it out with the offering energy of a man presenting a gift. You want some? No, my nutritionist says it's a complete meal. You have a nutritionist. Her name is Polina. I met her at the Sena market. She was selling handmade granola. He paused. She had a green apron, and she smiled at me when I bought 2 bags. 2 bags, you understand, as a conversation extension. He looked at the crisp bread. She has not returned to the market in 6 weeks. I keep going. That's, I started. Devotion, he said firmly. It's devotion. You want to tell me the man you're in love with is not worth standing in a cold market every Saturday for? I'm not in love with anyone. Timur looked at me with the particular patience of a man who has been driving someone for 12 years and believes he understands people. Yet, he said, he was so immediately, improbably warm that I found myself telling him, as I steered him toward the chairs, as I surrendered to the inevitability of the conversation, that I had been engaged once to a physician here at St. Michael's, and that it had ended when I found his screensaver was a photo of a woman who was not me. And he had explained this as complicated, in a way that suggested the complication was chiefly my expecting exclusivity. What kind of man would you want, Timur asked, with genuine curiosity, if you were going to bother? And I had said without thinking. Pulling on latex gloves for the next round, not the methodical kind. Not the kind who uses silence as a weapon. Not the kind who controls every room he walks into and knows it and does nothing to make you comfortable with it. Not that kind. Timur said nothing. He had a very particular expression on his face. What? I said. Nothing, he said. More crisp bread. Nikolai Volkov came back in 46 hours, not 48. He came alone. Or as alone as a man like that comes. There were 2 men in the corridor who were technically in the corridor and not in the room, which I understood was his version of alone. The wound was clean. No infection, healing faster than it should have been. You take care of yourself, I said, and it came out more surprised than I meant. Useful habit, he said. I redressed the wound in silence. His shirt was dark again. They were always dark, and I could smell something beneath the antiseptic. Something that was wood smoke and cold air, and something underneath that I could not name and did not try to. He had a second phone. I saw it when his jacket shifted, a slim black phone different from the one on the tray, different case, different wear pattern. Something about the way it sat suggested it lived in a different pocket than the other one, kept separate, kept apart. I noticed it. I said nothing. Nurses are trained to see and to wait. You'll be cleared for normal activity in a week, I said. Define normal. I looked at him. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. The shape of an almost smile, the place where a smile would be if one ever arrived. Everything except what put you here, I said. He stood. He was very close in the small room with the chart still in my hands and the monitor beeping its slow, patient rhythm and the sound of the ward beyond the door. Celeste, he said. Not Nurse Renard. I looked up. Thank you, he said, for not stopping. He left. I stood there for a moment in the rearranged air. And then from somewhere below thought, very quietly, without deciding to, I began to hum. The flowers arrived first. Not to me, that distinction matters. They arrived at the nurse station, addressed to the ward, from an anonymous donor. 60 white peonies in a steel vase that cost more than my monthly transport pass. A card that read only, for the staff of Trauma Bay 1, no name. Masha, the charge nurse who had been working nights since before I was born, held the card up and said, "Either someone is grateful or someone is guilty." I said nothing. That was Tuesday. By Thursday, the ward's ancient coffee machine, the one that had been producing something approximating motor oil for 4 years, the one that maintenance had visited 11 times without resolution, had been replaced. Quietly, overnight, industrial grade, the kind you see in the lobbies of buildings where the receptionist has a title, no one could explain it. "Management," said Masha, in a tone that meant she did not believe this for a moment. I went home that Thursday morning and looked up the name Nikolai Volkov. I should have done it sooner. I had not done it sooner because some part of me understood that knowing would change the specific quality of the not knowing, and the not knowing had been not comfortable, but honest. The way a bruise is honest. I read for 40 minutes without stopping. Then I closed the laptop and sat with my hands in my lap and the sound of the Neva traffic below, and I thought. I redressed his wound twice. I told him he was lucky. I hummed at him. And I had told him my name. Bratva is a word that means brotherhood. It is also a word that incent. Petersburg means a specific geography of power, the kind that doesn't appear in newspapers while it's operating and appears in them only in its aftermath. Nikolai Volkov's name appeared in the aftermath of 7 separate events over 12 years. He had never been charged. He had been questioned twice. Both times the question stopped. He had interests in shipping, in private security, in 3 legitimate hospitality businesses that I had almost certainly passed without knowing. He had been photographed at a charity gala for children's oncology research 18 months ago, in a dinner jacket, beside a woman with dark hair and a dress that cost more than my rent, and a smile that suggested she was accustomed to rooms like that. I recognized the expression in his photograph before I recognized the face, the stillness, the controlled arrangement of presence in a room, the way space organized itself around him without anyone seeming to notice. I had thought it was the blood loss. It was not the blood loss. I should have requested a ward reassignment. I know that. I have always known that, in the retrospective way, you know things after they have already stopped being preventable. Instead, I went back on shift Friday night and found him in the corridor outside Trauma Bay 1, not admitted, not a patient. Standing with his hands in his coat pockets, looking at the board above the nurse station, with the particular quality of attention that meant he was not actually looking at the board. "You shouldn't be here," I said. "I know," he said. A pause stretched between us that had texture to it, the specific texture of 2 people who are not saying something very large. "The coffee machine," I said, "the old one was inadequate. You can't, I stopped. I tried again. That's not something you can just do. And yet, he looked at me then, directly. The gray eyes had that quality again, of someone who has decided to look at a thing fully and see what happens. Walk with me. I'm on shift for 10 minutes. I cannot, Celeste. Just the name, not a command, not quite a request. Something in the space between them that had no clean category. I walked with him for 12 minutes, as it turned out. Down the east corridor and back, past the supply room and the relatives' waiting area with its uncomfortable chairs and its faded prints of the hermitage. He told me, with the brevity of someone practicing an unnatural habit, that he had 3 younger associates who handled his St. Petersburg operations in the legitimate sectors. He told me that Timur had been driving for him since both of them were young men without the sense they would later develop. He did not tell me about Grigori. I would not learn about Grigori for a long time, but on that corridor walk I saw something else. He slowed almost imperceptibly when we passed the door to the oncology ward. His gaze moved to it the way a compass needle moves, not toward, despite itself toward. He pulled it back. "What's in there?" I asked. "Nothing," he said. He said it with such precise control that I understood immediately it was not nothing. It was the opposite of nothing. It was the thing around which all of the control had been built. That was the first exterior wall. I was not yet looking for the door. Outside, through the tall windows at the corridor's end, I could hear rain beginning soft on the glass, the particular intimacy of rain on hospital windows at night, where the warm and the cold press against each other through 4 millimeters of glass. He stopped at the window. I stopped beside him. We stood there, not quite touching, not quite apart, and the rain came down, and somewhere behind us on the ward someone's monitor shifted rhythm, and I thought, I should go back. And I did not move. "Voroby," he said, quietly, more to the glass than to me. "That word," I said, "what does it mean?" A pause. "Sparrow," he said. "A bird that survives in places that should kill it." I turned to look at him. He was still looking at the glass. "That's not a compliment," I said. "No," he said. "It is not." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in years. The first time he touched me, neither of us had chosen it. That is what I told myself afterward. That is what I kept telling myself. In the specific, patient way you repeat something until it either becomes true or you stop needing it to be. It was the following Wednesday. It was raining again. St. Petersburg in June had apparently decided that rain was its primary vocabulary, and I was finishing a 12-hour shift that had included 2 code blues. One dislocated shoulder on a man who claimed he had fallen, and Timur appearing in the nurse station again with a small container of something green. "Spirulina pudding," he said before I could ask. "Why?" "Polina posted a recipe video. She has an account now, 17 followers." He paused with dignity. "I am 16 of them. Timur." I left comments, supportive but not aggressive, engaged but not overwhelming. I am pacing myself. "You made 17 accounts," he looked at the pudding. "The algorithm rewards engagement." I ate some of the pudding because I had not eaten in 6 hours, and it tasted, surprisingly, like a dessert that had given up on joy but still believed in nutrition. And then I heard the sound from the corridor, not loud, not panicked, but the specific compressed quality of controlled emergency, and I was already moving before the thought completed itself. He was in the stairwell, not collapsed, not unconscious. Nikolai Volkov would not allow himself those things in a hospital corridor. I understood that instinctively. But he was sitting on the 3rd step with his back against the wall and his forearms on his knees and his face doing something I had not seen it do before, which was attempting, unsuccessfully, to be blank. "The suture site. You reopened it," I said. "It's manageable. It's bleeding through your shirt." Manageable, but he did not move. I crouched in front of him. The stairwell light was the flat industrial white that renders everyone honest. In it, I could see not just the wound, not just the controlled breathing, but the thing beneath both of those. A specific cornered exhaustion, the kind that lives in the body for years before it surfaces. I need to look at it, I said. Here. You'd prefer the street. Something moved across his expression. He turned slightly to give me access to his side. I had my kit, nurses carry them the way surgeons carry opinions always, and I worked in the stairwell's flat white light, and as I worked I heard it. A sound, low and below language, coming from somewhere in the well. An echo, I thought, a ventilation sound. It was coming from me. I stopped. He said nothing. This time I did not restart. My hands found the reopened section, 3 centimeters, clean, nothing structural, and I worked. His hand moved, not toward me. But his left hand, resting on his knee, shifted, and his fingers, without purpose, without direction, came to rest against my wrist. Not gripping, barely pressure. The weight of a decision that hadn't finished deciding yet. I kept working. Neither of us mentioned it. When I finished, I sat back on my heels, and we were closer than the logistics of the work had strictly required, and the stairwell was very quiet. "You have a scar," I said. It had appeared when his shirt shifted, older than the suture, much older, running from the left shoulder down. Not surgical. The specific pattern of a thing survived before survival became policy. "Yes," he said. "How old were you?" A pause long enough to have a floor and a ceiling. 19. I did not ask what happened. He did not offer it. But something in his face, the stairwell's honesty working on him too, shifted, just slightly, like a door acknowledging a knock it isn't ready to open. "The second phone," I said. He went very still. "I saw it," I said. "When you were admitted, I'm not asking, I've been wondering." He looked at me for a long time. "It's for one number," he said. "Only one person has that number." "Who?" "Someone I am not ready to discuss." He said it with such careful precision, not ready, not unwilling. Not none of your business. That I understood this was a man being as honest as he currently knew how to be. The mystery of the second phone closed here in the stairwell. It was not a mistress, not an operation, not a weapon. It was one number, one person, and the weight he gave it was the weight of grief that had learned to organize itself. I would not know for many more chapters who was on the other end. But I knew, sitting in a hospital stairwell with antiseptic on my hands and a criminal's fingers barely touching my wrist, that I had already stopped counting this as a patient relationship. The assault happened at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I know the time because I checked my watch when I heard the stairwell door, and I had that particular nurse's habit of registering time the way other people register temperature, automatically. Without deciding to, the way the body prepares to document what the mind hasn't yet admitted is happening. 2 men, neither of them patients. One of them had a photograph. I saw it in his hand before I understood what I was seeing, a photograph that was a photograph of me. What happened in the next 4 minutes I have told in pieces to various people, and I will not reconstruct it for the narrative value of it here, except to say, I had been raised by a mother who was a field nurse in a conflict zone I will not name, and she had not raised a woman who waited for rescue. I had a metal IV stand. I used it. I was bleeding from my ribs by the time the door at the far end crashed open, but both men were on the floor, and I was standing. And when Nikolai Volkov came through that door with 2 of his men and found me, standing, bleeding, IV stand still in my hand, he stopped. Just stopped. His men went around him. He stood absolutely still. I looked at him. "I texted you," I said. My voice was perfectly level. I was very proud of this. "From one of their phones. I saw your number in the system." He crossed the distance between us in 4 steps and took the IV stand from my hand. Not like he was disarming me, but like he was removing something that was now heavy, and I could stop carrying it. "You're bleeding," he said. "I know. Celeste, I know." My hands finally began to shake. He put his hand over both of mine, and the shaking stopped, not because his hand was steady, but because something about the warmth of it gave the shaking somewhere to go. In the room they took me to, his men had swept 3 floors, I found out later. The kind of sweep that suggested this was not improvised. Timur appeared with a first aid kit, and the expression of a man whose worst fears had proven themselves correct. "I said," he told the wall from the very beginning, "I said the situation was developing faster than was safe." "Timur," said Nikolai, "I'm just saying, Timur." He sat. He opened the first aid kit. He had prepared spirulina pudding, which was in a small container on the side table, and I ate it because my body had decided that shock and appetite were not mutually exclusive. Nikolai sat across from me, while his men dealt with the men in the corridor. He sat with his elbows on his knees, which was the position he took when he was thinking hard about something he had not resolved. I had learned this. I had learned more about how he carried himself than I had consciously acknowledged. "The men work for Savin," said the one called Vadim from the door. Grigory Savin's crew. Something passed over Nikolai's face that I could not read. It was fast, faster than control could close over it, and it was not surprise. It was the specific pain of a confirmation you had been hoping would remain a suspicion. Grigory Savin. The name meant nothing to me then. "You're going to tell me now," I said, "what this was." He looked at me. "There are people who believe I care about you," he said. "More than is strategically advisable. Do they have reason to believe that?" A pause that had weight. "Yes," he said. I sat with that for a moment. The room was quiet. Timur was examining something in the first aid kit with tremendous concentration. "The night you were brought in," I said. "The knife, that was a warning," he said. "From the same direction. You knew when you came back, I suspected, and you came anyway." "Yes." I was holding the gauze he'd pressed to my ribs. My other hand was in my lap. Neither of us moved toward the other. And the distance between us was very precisely the distance of 2 people who have acknowledged something that cannot be unacknowledged, and are learning what that means. "I'm a nurse," I said. "I work nights. I live in a 17-minute walk from this building. I have a small life, Nikolai. I have a life that fits inside the borders I drew for it." "I know," he said. "I don't think you do." He looked at me with those gray eyes, and in the flat light of the room, in the aftermath of the corridor and the shaking and the spirulina pudding, he said, "You're not asking me to go." I opened my mouth. I closed it. "No," I said after a long time. "I'm not." They brought her to the safe house on the western edge of the city. And by the time the building was secured, and the men had reported, and the coffee Timur made was sitting in a cup going cold on the table, Nikolai stood in the hallway outside the room where she was sleeping and understood, finally, completely, without further negotiation with himself, why. She had kept working. That was it. That was all of it. Every person who had ever been brought into a room he occupied had stopped what they were doing, had recalibrated, had found some way to acknowledge him, however subtle, a stillness, a quickening, an adjustment of posture that betrayed awareness of power. It was involuntary in most of them. He did not blame it. It was simply what happened. She had kept cutting his shirt away. She had kept pressing the gauze. She had kept her eyes on the wound and her hands on the instruments, and she had hummed that low, nameless sound, and she had not looked at him as though he were power or threat or problem. She had looked at him the way she looked at every other body that came through that door, as something that needed care, something that was, in this room, in this context, simply hurt. No one in 20 years had looked at him that way. He stood in the hallway for a while longer than was necessary. Then he went back to the work. The attack on the hospital had been intended to send a message, not to kill her. That was Grigory's style, Nikolai knew, had always known. Grigori built pressure campaigns the way architects build structures, methodically, patiently, with the long view. He had been watching Nikolai for months, calculating the new variable in his equations, and he had decided that the new variable had a name. Nikolai had protected assets before. He had moved people, secured people, kept people breathing. This was not that. This was something that required a different word, and he was not going to use the word yet, but it lived in him now the way the scar on his shoulder lived in him, permanently. Without asking permission. She woke 3 hours later to find him at the table across the room. "You watched me sleep," she said, not accusatory, observational. "I worked," he said. "You were in the room." She sat up. Her dark hair was loose. She wore it up at the hospital always, the particular efficiency of a person for whom function preceded everything, and loose it changed her face, made it younger. Made it, he thought, the face she had before she learned what to armor. "Nikolai, yes. How bad is this going to get?" He looked at her steadily. "Before it gets better. That's not an answer. No," he set down the report in his hands. "It's honest." Timur appeared in the doorway with 2 cups and the expression of someone who has been waiting to be useful and was now delivering that usefulness. Tea. "And I spoke to Polina." Every person in the room turned. "Her granola business has a website now," he said. "There is a contact form. I have contacted it." "Timur," said Nikolai. "I expressed interest in a bulk order," he said with great dignity, as a conversation initiator. "This is called guerrilla intimacy. I read about it." Celeste made a sound. It took Nikolai a moment to identify it as a laugh, short, surprised, not performed. The real kind. He found he had been watching her make it. "Here," said Timur, and gave her the tea with the careful ceremony of a man who was doing the one thing he knew how to do for the situation at hand. Later, when Timur had gone and the house had gone to its quiet operational sounds, guards rotating, comms on low, she came to stand beside him at the window. The city was the city. Lights on the Neva, traffic below, the ordinary machinery of the world continuing without acknowledgement of the specific weight of this room. "I keep thinking about something," she said. "Tell me." "That first night you told me to not stop." She looked at the glass. "You could have been giving me an order." "I wasn't." "I know." She paused. "That's the part I keep thinking about." His hand at his side was 4 inches from hers on the sill. He did not close the distance, but he did not move away. "Voroby," he said quietly. She turned her head slightly, not quite looking at him, close, the sound of the city, the heat of the room against the cold glass. 4 inches of space that was not accidental and not innocent and not going to be bridged tonight, but was being honestly counted. "Go to sleep," he said. "Tomorrow the war gets louder." She went. At the door she paused. "Nikolai." She did not turn. "The second phone, the one person whose number is on it." He waited. "Whenever you're ready," she said, and went. He stood at the window for a long time afterward, looking at nothing in particular, holding a thing that had no name yet but weighed exactly as much as the truth. The war announced itself quietly, the way the worst things do. It was not an attack first. It was a withdrawal, suppliers going silent, 2 legitimate businesses losing contracts within 72 hours. A shipment delayed at port with paperwork that was technically correct and operationally devastating. Grigori Savin knew how to use bureaucracy. He had been inside Nikolai's organization long enough to know which threads, pulled, would make the whole fabric tighten. I understood almost none of this. What I understood was the faces of the men around Nikolai, the way they had stopped eating in shifts and started eating while standing, the way the phones never went fully quiet anymore, the way Timur had stopped mentioning Polina, which was the clearest signal of all. I asked Vadim to explain it to me. He looked at me with the particular expression of someone deciding how much truth is kind. "Someone who should be on our side is not," he said. "Grigori." A pause. "You didn't hear that from me." What does he want? What they always want, said Vadim, the chair at the head of the table. He paused. And every person who sits with the man currently in that chair to have no safe place to go. I looked at him. I'm a liability, I said. He said nothing, which was its own answer. Masha was the one who paid for my being close to something I had not understood was a fire. She was not hurt badly. This is what I told myself, and it is technically true. 3 men came to her apartment, she told me afterward, and they did not touch her. They sat in her kitchen. They had tea, she said, with a kind of appalled wonder. They made themselves tea in my kitchen, she kept saying, and they asked questions about me, my hours, my routes, my habits. They left her unharmed. But she was 61 years old, and she had been afraid, truly afraid, in her own kitchen where she had lived for 30 years. And when I saw her face when I arrived, pale, contained, refusing to accept any fussing, I understood what his world cost when it touched yours. I could leave. That was the thing I had to sit with, alone in the room they gave me, with the sounds of the safe house around me and the Neva somewhere in the dark beyond the window. I could genuinely leave. No one would stop me. Nikolai had said it, had not said it in words, but had said it in every way that mattered. This is the door. It is not locked from your side. My mother had survived a war zone. She had come home and made a life that fit inside careful borders. And she had taught me, not in words but in the architecture of the way she moved through rooms, that the safest love was the kind that did not require you to stand in the blast radius. I sat with that for a long time, and then I thought about a man in a stairwell bleeding, saying it is manageable and meaning it. I thought about the way his hand had rested over mine when the shaking started. I thought about him standing at a window not moving away. I could leave. I got up and went to find him. He was in the main room, alone, coat on, about to go somewhere that would not be safe. Don't, I said. He turned. Whatever you're about to do alone, I said, don't. This isn't negotiable, Celeste. I know. I walked toward him. I'm not negotiating. I'm telling you that I am choosing to be here. Not because I don't understand what it costs, because I do. I stopped in front of him. Masha is safe. I know it could have been worse. I know it might get worse. I am standing here telling you that I have counted that and I am still here. I looked at him. I need you to understand that this is a choice, not Stockholm Syndrome, not confusion. A choice. The room was very quiet. Something in his face, in the controlled gray of it, opened slightly. The way a fist opens when it decides, after a long time, that it no longer needs to be won. The second phone, he said. I waited. The only number on it is a doctor, he said. A physician at the hospital of St. Anna. She monitors a fund I endow anonymously for families whose loved ones died in hospital corridors while the system failed them. I looked at him. My sister, he said. Her name was Anya. She was 17. He said nothing else. He did not need to. And I understood, with the particular completeness of understanding that arrives all at once rather than in pieces. Everything about the coffee machine, the peonies. The way his gaze stuck to the oncology ward door, the specific quality of his stillness in hospital rooms. Nikolai, I said. Go back to your room, he said. His voice was not unkind. I'll be back before morning. He left. I stood in the empty room and the silence had weight, and beneath the weight was something that felt terribly, inconveniently, completely, like the beginning of the rest of my life. They took me on a Thursday. I was not supposed to be alone. I understand that now. I had gone back to the hospital, not to work, only to collect things. Only to explain to Masha in person what I could not say on a phone. And I had told Vadim I was going, and Vadim had said he would send 2 men, and the 2 men had arrived 8 minutes after I had already left because I had not waited, because I had been impatient, because I had believed, with the particular stupidity of a person who has survived everything so far, that I could make a small errand fast enough to outrun the world. I was in the basement supply room, filling a bag with items I should have taken 3 days earlier when the lights went out. There were 3 of them. I did not scream. My mother had told me, screaming spends energy. Moving spends energy. Spend your energy on what works. What worked in the end was the shelf unit I pulled down across the only door. It bought me 47 minutes. In 47 minutes, you can do a great deal of thinking. I thought about Masha's face when I'd found her. I thought about Nikolai at the window. I thought about the textbook. It had been left at the nurse station 3 weeks earlier, a mid-century medical reference, the kind no one uses anymore, left without a card. I'd kept it because it was beautiful, the illustrations precise and old-fashioned. I'd found a note tucked inside, handwritten on paper so worn it had clearly been folded and unfolded many times. A note about systemic failure, about the specific documented failure of a hospital to respond in time, about a girl, about a corridor. I had read it aloud to Masha. I had said, "Someone has been carrying this for a very long time." I had not known. I had been reading Nikolai's wound aloud in his hospital to his men's charge nurse, while he stood 10 feet down the corridor unable to speak about it. In the dark of the supply room with the shelf across the door, I sat with that and with the sound of my own breathing, and I was not afraid. I was something else, a focused, specific determination that had nothing to do with bravery and everything to do with the fact that I had not come this far to end in a basement. When the door finally came open, it was not Nikolai first. It was the traitor. Grigory Savin was a man of 50, with a face that had learned to be kind long before it learned to be honest. He was the kind of handsome that only works if you are not looking directly at it. He stood in the doorway with the light behind him and said, "Celeste, I'm sorry it came to this." "You're not," I said. He looked mildly surprised. "Nikolai has been here 3 years too long," he said. "The organization needs." "I don't care about the organization," I said. "I care about the fact that you ordered 2 men to come to a 61-year-old woman's kitchen and frighten her over tea." He blinked. "You were Nikolai's second in command," I said. I was still sitting on the floor. I had decided in the 47 minutes that standing up for this would grant it a dignity it hadn't earned. "You were there, weren't you, the night Anya died? You were there and you saw the physician leave the room and you said nothing. You did nothing, and Nikolai has never known that, has he?" The silence that followed this was a specific kind of silence. Grigory's face did something that, briefly, horribly, looked almost like relief. Like a man who has been carrying something for 30 years and has been caught with it at last. "How do you know?" he started. The door behind him exploded off its hinges. What happened in the next 3 minutes I know only in pieces. I know that Nikolai came through the door the way something in nature comes, not fast exactly, but inexorable. A force that has already decided the outcome and is now simply executing it. I know that there were 5 men with him, and that Grigory did not have 5. I know that the specific sound of Nikolai saying my name across a dark room is something I will hear for the rest of my life. I know that I stood up, not because he had arrived. Because I had stayed standing for 47 minutes, and I was not going to be found on the floor. "Celeste." He crossed the room and his hands went to my face first, not my hands, not to check for injury, to my face. The way you check that a person is still fully present, and not just physically ambulatory. "Are you?" "I'm fine." I also wasn't. The specific fine of someone who has held something together for 47 minutes and can now feel the seams. Grigory knows about Anya. He was there. He saw the physician leave and he didn't. "I know," he said. Something moved across his face. "I know," he said again more quietly. "We found the documentation 2 hours ago." He kept his hands at my face, and his eyes went through me and past me and into somewhere I could not follow. Processing, maybe. or finishing a thought that had been 30 years in the building. "What will you do?" I said. "What needs doing?" he said. From the corridor came the sound of Vadim's voice, businesslike and final. I put my hand over his on my face, just for a moment, just to anchor us both to the room. Timur was in the car outside with blankets and the small container of spirulina pudding, which I was beginning to suspect he carried the way other people carry emergency chocolate. "She texted," he said without preamble, as soon as we were in the car. He was looking at his phone with the contained joy of a man who had maintained devotion in the face of all odds. "Polina." She texted. She said the bulk order inquiry made her laugh. "Laughing is good," I said. "Laughing is excellent. Laughing means she read it twice." He looked at me with shining eyes. "I'm going to ask her for coffee." "Timur," said Nikolai from the front. "I know the timing is Timur." He was quiet for 2 seconds. "She texted," he said very quietly to himself. I looked out the window at the city going past, the Neva gray and wide and honest. The summer night that wasn't fully dark because it was June in the north, and darkness never fully committed in June. And I thought about a note in a textbook, and a man who had endowed a fund for families whose hospitals had failed them and had never put his name on it. Nikolai's hand found mine in the back of the car. He didn't say anything. He just held it. I didn't say anything either. We sat like that all the way back across the city, while Timur drove with the careful ceremony of a man who understood that some cargo was more important than other cargo. And the night was pale and wide, and the war was almost over. The last battle was not cinematic. I wish I could tell you it was, that it resolved in a single confrontation, clean lines, a clarity that matched its cost. Real endings are not made that way. The last battle for Nikolai's empire, the final dismantling of Grigory Savin's carefully constructed alternative machinery, happened over 11 days, and I was not present for most of it, and I will not pretend to have been. What I will tell you is what it cost. Vadim survived. He was in the hospital for 9 days with a wound to his shoulder that I was peripherally involved in treating. And he bore it with the specific stoic indignation of a man who considers being hospitalized a professional embarrassment. A man named Pavel, young, 23, who had been with Nikolai for 2 years and who Timur had once described as like a nephew I did not ask for but have accepted, did not survive. I never met Pavel. I know him only as the weight in Timur's silence for several days after, the way he stopped talking about Polina, the way he ate the crisp bread mechanically and without ceremony. Nikolai told me about Pavel at 3 in the morning, sitting in the kitchen of the safe house with 2 cups of tea going cold between us. He was 23, he said. I did not say I'm sorry. That seemed insufficient. He wanted to start a restaurant, Nikolai said. He made his own pasta. He brought it in once. He stopped. It was very good. We sat with that. Grigory was dealt with in the way men like Grigory are dealt with in the world Nikolai inhabits. And I will not describe it because I do not know the full particulars and because what I know is only this. The morning it was over, Nikolai came to find me, and he looked like a man who has carried a weight so long that, when it is lifted, he cannot immediately locate the absence. He sat across from me. "It's done," he said. "I know. Grigory confirmed it the night Anya died. He was 22. He didn't know yet what he was capable of." He paused. "Or he did and was frightened by it and chose the easier direction. Does it matter which? I don't know." He looked at his hands. "I've been asking myself that for 3 days." I reached across the table. I took his hands in mine, the way he'd taken mine in the stairwell, not gripping, barely pressure, the weight of a decision that had finished deciding. He looked at them. "You're going to say something useful," he said. "I'm not," I said. "I'm not going to say anything." We sat there for a long time, with the sounds of the house around us, and Pavel's pasta somewhere in the silence. and Anya 17 years old in a hospital corridor. And the specific human weight of everything that had happened and could not be unhappened and would have to be carried anyway. It was over. It was not, in any of the ways that mattered, over, but it was over. The autumn came to St. Petersburg with its particular relentlessness. Nikolai's world rebuilt itself the way cities rebuild, not all at once, not cleanly, but pragmatically, beginning with the infrastructure and moving slowly toward the aesthetic. I watched it from a proximity that required a new category, not nurse, not witness, not asset, his. The word arrived without fanfare one October morning when I was making coffee in a kitchen that had become, at some indeterminate point, our kitchen. And he came in from an early call and stood in the doorway and looked at me with the gray eyes that I had learned to read the way I'd once learned to read the ward sounds, by layer, by frequency, by what lived underneath. "Stay," he said. "I live here," I said. "Permanently," he said. I turned from the coffee machine. He was not looking away, and he was not looking away in the specific way of a man who has decided this particular eye contact matters and will not flinch from it. "You're asking me," I said. "Yes, not telling." "No," I looked at him for a moment. "Why not?" "Because," he said, with the careful precision of someone saying something true for the first time, "you are the first person I have ever not wanted to tell." I held the coffee cup. "All right," I said. "All right, yes, or all right, you need time." "All right, yes." He crossed the kitchen and slowly, with that quality of deliberate arrival he brought to everything, he kissed me. His hand at my jaw, the same place he'd checked that I was present in the basement. The coffee cup between us. The morning light on the Neva somewhere beyond the window. Not theatrical. Not the culmination of a film, just honest. Just the two of us in a kitchen that had become ours, choosing each other in the unromantic light of an October morning, with coffee in my hands, and the news on low somewhere in the next room. Timur and Polina went on their first date in November. She was, apparently, exactly as green apron wonderful as he had imagined. She had laughed at his stories. She had ordered something that was not from the raw food section of the menu, and he had interpreted this as flexibility and depth of character. She had agreed to a second date. He reported all of this in real time, via text, to Nikolai, who read each message with the expression of a man who has resigned himself to caring about outcomes he did not plan for. "He's happy," I said. "He's insufferable," said Nikolai. "He's happy," I said again, a pause. "Yes." In December, Nikolai took me to the hospital of St. Anna, not to the administration. Not to announce anything. He took me to a small room off the east corridor, where a plaque was mounted on the wall, simple, brass, recent, that read, "In memory of Anna Volkov, 1980–1998. That the corridors hold no one alone. I stood in front of it for a long time. He stood beside me. "You funded the emergency response restructuring," I said. "The new protocol that the hospital adopted 4 years ago for corridor triage. The physician I mentioned," he said, "she handles the implementation." I turned to look at him. "You've been doing this for 20 years, I said. "Not loudly," he said. I thought about a man who had built an empire out of power and control and silence, and had used all of it, quietly, anonymously, without credit, to make sure no one else stood in a corridor alone. "Nikolai," I said, "I don't need Nikolai." He looked at me. "Voroby," he said, and the word was completely different from the first time, not cold, not observational, not a category of survival. It was the warmest word I had ever heard him say, which is perhaps unfair to all other warm words, but there it is. "I love you," I said. He said nothing. But his hand found mine in the small room off the corridor, and he held it, not barely, not tentatively, not with the weight of a decision still deciding. Completely. Like a man who has been holding on to something for a very long time and has finally found the thing worth holding. "Yes," he said, after a moment. It was not, in the conventional sense, an adequate response. It was, in the specific language of Nikolai Volkov, everything. 8 months. St. Petersburg in July was everything St. Petersburg promised itself it would be in the other 11 months. The light that lasted until midnight, the Neva going silver in the evenings. The linden trees again with their 3 weeks of sweetness. The particular quality of the air that made you believe briefly in the city's most optimistic version of itself. I had renegotiated my hours at St. Michael's. I still worked trauma that was non-negotiable, for reasons that had to do with who I was before Nikolai and who I had not stopped being, but the nights were fewer now. And the walks home were shorter, and the apartment was no longer 17 minutes from the hospital, because the apartment was no longer the apartment. Masha came for dinner in May. She sat in the kitchen and ate borscht that Nikolai had made. He cooked with the same methodical precision he brought to everything, following recipes with the focus of a man who respects instructions. And she looked around the kitchen, and then she looked at Nikolai, and then she looked at me. "Good," she said, which was the highest form of approval available in Masha's vocabulary. Nikolai said nothing, but something in his expression did a thing it had been learning to do. Something adjacent to ease. The slow relaxation of a man who has been standing at attention for most of his life, and is beginning, incrementally, to understand that the room is safe. It was an ordinary Saturday when it happened. We were in the kitchen, our kitchen, which I still thought with a small specific warmth every time the words arranged themselves, and I was setting down a tray of things I'd brought from the market. Bread, apples, the small jar of honey from the vendor on the second row, who always gave me extra because I had once, months ago, splinted his daughter's sprained wrist in the aisle. Nikolai was at the table with the papers he brought home on Saturdays. He had a particular relationship with Saturday papers. He treated them as accounting, as evidence, as documents to be understood rather than merely read. I set down the tray. And then the phone rang from the next room, and there was a sound from somewhere on the floor where a shopping bag had tipped. And I was thinking about whether the honey vendor's daughter had been seen by anyone for a follow-up, and without deciding to, without knowing I was doing it, I started to hum. The low, nameless sound, below thought, below intention. Just the sound of hands occupied and a mind doing what minds do when they are genuinely at peace, running quietly, underneath everything like water under ice. I realized it was happening. I stopped. From behind me, from the direction of the table, Nikolai said nothing. I turned. He was looking at me, not at the papers, not at the door. At me, with the gray eyes that I had learned to read, all their layers, all their frequencies. And what was in them now was something I had not seen there in the trauma bay, or the stairwell, or the kitchen in October, or the room at St. Anna. It was, I understood, the thing that had been building since he first heard it. The thing he had noticed and named to himself and held for a very long time without saying. "You're doing it again," he said. "I know," I said. "I don't always notice." "I know you don't," he said. He looked at me for another moment. Then he went back to the papers. And I stood there in the kitchen with the honey and the bread, and the summer light coming in at that particular angle that only existed in July, and I thought, this is the life. Not the dramatic version. This, the ordinary morning after everything. I began to hum again. He did not look up. But the corner of his mouth moved, the shape of the almost smile I had learned to read. And I understood that he could hear it, and he was not going to stop it, and he did not want to stop it. And that this small, unconscious, nameless sound had been, from the beginning, the thing that told him the truth about everything. "Voroby," he said to the papers. "Yes," I said, and that was all, that was everything. The word completely different from the first time he'd used it, no longer cold, no longer a category of survival, no longer a man observing a woman through the glass of his own distance. Just a name. Just mine, warm all the way through, in the way of things that have earned their warmth through every difficult mile of the road that led here. The summer light moved across the kitchen floor. The Neva was silver beyond the window, and we were, in the most ordinary and radical sense of the word, home.